At 0437 on the morning of August 7th, 1942, Captain Harl Pease, Jr. climbed into the cockpit of a B-17E Flying Fortress that had no business being in the air. 24 years old, 2 months of combat flying, a reputation for never quitting on a mission. The aircraft beneath him was a wreck. Battle damage from a raid 2 days earlier had shattered the oxygen system, destroyed the superchargers on 2 engines, and punched holes through the fuselage that let tropical air whistle through the cabin like a wind tunnel. The ground crew had condemned the plane. The squadron commander had removed it from the mission roster. Maintenance officers had written it off as unflyable, but Harl Pease had other plans. While mechanics slept and the other crews prepared their functional aircraft, Pease had gathered volunteers. Men who understood that the mission to Rabaul was critical, that every bomber counted, that replacements were not coming. They had worked through the night, cannibalizing parts from other damaged aircraft, improvising repairs with whatever materials they could find. Now, as the first gray light touched the runway at 7 Mile Airdrome near Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, Harl Pease was about to fly a condemned bomber 500 miles into the most heavily defended Japanese stronghold in the South Pacific. The target was Rabaul. The name alone made veteran pilots go quiet. Japanese headquarters for the entire Southwest Pacific Theater. 5 airfields, hundreds of fighters, anti-aircraft batteries that could fill the sky with steel. American bombers that flew to Rabaul rarely came back with their full crews. Many did not come back at all. Pease knew the odds. Every pilot in the 19th Bombardment Group knew the odds. The statistics had been calculated and discussed in briefing rooms, where young men tried not to think about what the numbers meant for their personal survival. But Harl Pease was not thinking about survival that morning. He was thinking about the invasion fleet heading toward Guadalcanal. American Marines were about to storm ashore on that jungle island, 600 miles to the east. The Japanese at Rabaul had the aircraft and the ships to slaughter those Marines on the beaches, unless someone stopped them. That someone was the 19th Bombardment Group. 16 B-17 seconds, scheduled to hit Rabaul at dawn, destroying as many Japanese aircraft as possible before they could reach Guadalcanal. 15 bombers had been prepared and crewed according to regulations. The 16th was Harl Pease's resurrection project, a flying corpse that he had willed back to life through sheer determination. The Pratt & Whitney engines coughed to life, one by one. Pease listened to each cylinder, feeling the vibrations through the control yoke. Assessing whether the repairs would hold, the superchargers were still damaged. Above 15,000 feet, the engines would lose power rapidly. The oxygen system remained compromised. At high altitude, the crew would struggle to breathe. None of it mattered. The mission was going. Harl Pease was going with it. If you want to see how this doomed mission unfolded, and why Harl Pease became one of the most honored pilots of World War II, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more viewers. Subscribe if you're new here. Back to Pease. The B-17E was the workhorse of American strategic bombing in 1942. 65 feet of aluminum, 4 engines producing 4,800 total horsepower, a defensive armament of 8 50-caliber machine guns, designed to fight off enemy interceptors. The Flying Fortress earned its name from the bristling gun positions that covered every angle of approach. But no amount of defensive firepower could compensate for mechanical failure. A B-17 that could not climb above the effective ceiling of enemy fighters was a B-17 that would be swarmed and destroyed. A bomber without functioning oxygen would see its crew become sluggish and confused at altitude, easy prey for Japanese Zeros that thrived in thin air. Pease's aircraft had both problems. He was taking his crew into combat with handicaps that experienced pilots would have considered disqualifying. But the mission was too important, and replacements were 8,000 miles away in California. The other 15 bombers were already taxiing toward the runway. Pease fell into formation at the end of the line, his patched-together bomber looking no different from the functional aircraft ahead of him. Only his crew knew the truth about what they were flying. 7 men had volunteered to join him. They could have stayed behind. No one would have blamed them. The aircraft was officially grounded. Their decision to fly was entirely voluntary, a choice to risk their lives on a machine that might fail at any moment. But they climbed aboard anyway. Men who believed in the mission, who trusted their pilot, who understood that sometimes the mathematics of war demanded that impossible odds be accepted. The formation lifted off at 0500. 16 flying fortresses climbing into the pre-dawn darkness. They turned north toward the Solomon Sea, toward Rabaul, toward whatever awaited them over that volcanic fortress. Harl Pease Jr. was born on April 10th, 1918, in Plymouth, New Hampshire. His father, Harl Pease Sr., was a farmer and businessman who had built a comfortable life in the New England countryside. His mother, Florence, raised young Harl with the values of hard work and quiet determination that characterized rural New Hampshire. The family moved to Montana when Harl was still a child. The vast skies of the American West became his playground. He grew up watching aircraft pass overhead, the same fascination that would grip an entire generation of young men who came of age during the golden era of aviation. Harl was not an obviously remarkable child. He did not dominate athletics or academics. What he possessed was something less visible, but more important: an absolute refusal to quit. Teachers and coaches noticed it. When other children gave up on difficult tasks, Harl continued. When obstacles appeared, he found ways around them. He graduated from high school in 1936 and enrolled at the University of Montana. Aviation programs were expanding across the country, and Harl joined the civilian pilot training program that was quietly preparing young Americans for a war that many could see coming. He earned his private pilot's license in 1939, the same year Germany invaded Poland. The war in Europe seemed distant from Montana, but the military was already accelerating its pilot training programs. Young men with flying experience were suddenly valuable. Pease enlisted in the Army Air Corps in July 1940. He reported to flight training with more hours in his logbook than most candidates, and the instructors quickly recognized his abilities. He was not flashy, not aggressive, not the kind of pilot who impressed with daring maneuvers. Instead, he was steady, reliable, completely focused on the mission. The kind of pilot who got the job done regardless of circumstances. He earned his wings and commission in 1941. The assignment to heavy bombers came next. B-17 training at airfields across the American West. By December 7, 1941, Second Lieutenant Harl Pease Jr. was a qualified B-17 pilot waiting for the war that had just arrived. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the American military overnight. Pilots who had been training at a peacetime pace suddenly found themselves preparing for immediate combat deployment. The Japanese were advancing across the Pacific, seizing island after island, threatening to cut the supply lines between America and Australia. Pease's unit, the 19th Bombardment Group, was one of the first heavy bomber groups deployed to the Pacific. They arrived in Australia in February 1942, immediately thrown into a desperate defensive campaign that offered little hope of success. The situation in the Southwest Pacific in early 1942 was catastrophic. The Philippines had fallen. The Dutch East Indies were collapsing. Singapore had surrendered. Japanese forces seemed unstoppable, their naval and air forces dominating every engagement. The 19th Bombardment Group was tasked with slowing the Japanese advance, buying time for reinforcements that were months away. They flew missions against enemy shipping, against invasion forces, against the expanding ring of Japanese bases that threatened to strangle Australia. The losses were appalling. B-17 seconds that flew against Japanese targets rarely returned undamaged. Crews were killed, wounded, or captured with terrible regularity. Replacement aircraft arrived slowly. Replacement crews arrived even slower. Pease flew his first combat mission in March 1942. The target was a Japanese convoy approaching the Malay Peninsula. The bombers encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zero fighters. Several B-17 seconds were lost. Pease's aircraft took hits but made it home. That first mission established the pattern that would define his service. He was calm under fire, steady in the cockpit, absolutely committed to completing the mission regardless of what happened around him. Other pilots noted his determination. Crew members requested assignment to his aircraft. The missions continued through spring and summer 1942. Each one seemed more difficult than the last. The Japanese continued their advance. American forces continued their retreat, and the 19th Bombardment Group continued to throw themselves against impossible odds because there was no one else to do it. By August 1942, Pease had been promoted to captain. He was one of the most experienced pilots in the squadron, a veteran of dozens of combat missions over some of the most heavily defended targets in the Pacific. He had earned a reputation for never turning back, never abandoning a mission, never letting mechanical problems or enemy opposition stop him from reaching his target. That reputation would be tested on August 7th in ways that no one could have imagined. The invasion of Guadalcanal was the first American offensive operation of the Pacific War. After 8 months of defeat and retreat, the United States was finally going on the attack. Marines would storm ashore on an island that the Japanese were using to construct an airfield that would threaten the supply lines to Australia. The operation was a gamble. The Marines were landing at the extreme range of American air cover. Naval support would be limited and temporary. If the Japanese responded quickly with their forces at Rabaul, the invasion could become a massacre. That was where the 19th Bombardment Group came in. Their mission was to neutralize Japanese air power at Rabaul during the critical first hours of the landing. Destroy the bombers before they could attack the invasion fleet. Destroy the fighters before they could establish air superiority over Guadalcanal. The briefing on August 6th laid out the plan in stark terms. 16 B-17 seconds would attack Rabaul at dawn on August 7th, timing their arrival to coincide with the Marine landings 600 miles to the east. The bombers would strike the main airfield at Guadalcanal, targeting aircraft, fuel supplies, and ammunition dumps. The risks were considerable. Rabaul was the most heavily defended Japanese base in the South Pacific. Intelligence estimated at least 100 fighters available for interception. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed every approach to the airfield complex, and the distance meant that any bomber damaged over the target would face a long flight home with little hope of emergency landing. Pease listened to the briefing with the same calm attention he brought to every mission. The target was dangerous. The mission was critical. He would fly. The problem was his aircraft. 2 days earlier, on August 5th, Pease had flown a mission against Japanese shipping near Rabaul. The bomber had taken severe damage from anti-aircraft fire. Shrapnel had torn through the fuselage, destroying the centralized oxygen system that allowed the crew to function at high altitude. The superchargers on 2 engines had been damaged, reducing their power output significantly. Hydraulic lines had been cut, making the landing gear and flaps operate erratically. When Pease landed at 7 Mile Airdrome after that mission, the ground crew had examined the damage and shaken their heads. The aircraft needed extensive repairs that would take days to complete. Spare parts were almost non-existent. The bomber was effectively finished. The squadron commander assigned Pease to a different aircraft for the Rabaul mission, but that aircraft developed engine problems during pre-flight checks on August 6th. By evening, it was clear that the replacement bomber would not be ready in time. Harl Pease was faced with a choice. He could stand down from the mission, acknowledge that equipment failures had removed him from the flight roster, and wait for the next opportunity. No one would question the decision. Mechanical problems were beyond any pilot's control. Instead, Pease walked out to the line where his damaged bomber sat, its holes covered with fabric patches, its engines silent and cold. He began inspecting the aircraft, assessing what needed to be fixed, calculating what could be improvised. Then he started asking for volunteers. The crew that gathered around Pease that night understood exactly what they were being asked to do. The aircraft was damaged. The repairs would be improvised. The mission would require flying a compromised bomber against the strongest Japanese defenses in the Pacific. They volunteered anyway. The work continued through the night. Mechanics and crew members scavenged parts from other damaged aircraft. They patched holes with whatever materials they could find. They tested systems and discovered which ones functioned adequately and which ones would require workarounds. The oxygen system could not be fully repaired. Portable oxygen bottles would have to supplement the damaged centralized system. The crew would need to ration their breathing carefully at altitude. The superchargers on engines 2 and 4 remained compromised. The aircraft would not be able to climb as high as the other bombers in the formation. Pease would have to fly at lower altitude, within easier reach of Japanese fighters. The hydraulic system was patched but unreliable. Landing would require manual extension of the gear and flaps, a procedure that took longer and carried more risk. None of these problems caused Pease to reconsider. As each issue was identified, he simply noted it and continued with the preparations. The mission was going. His aircraft would be part of it. By 0400 on August 7th, the work was complete. The B-17E was not repaired to factory specifications. It was not safe by any reasonable standard. But it could fly, and Harl Pease intended to fly it. The formation crossed the Solomon Sea in the gray light of early morning. 16B, 17 seconds, in loose formation, conserving fuel for the long flight ahead. The radio remained silent. Japanese listening stations monitored American frequencies, and any transmission might alert the defenses at Rabaul. Pease's aircraft struggled to keep pace. The damaged superchargers meant his engines produced less power at altitude. While the other bombers climbed toward their assigned altitude of 22,000 feet, Pease found his aircraft maxing out around 18,000. The 4,000-foot difference was significant. It meant that Pease would be flying below the rest of the formation, within easier range of anti-aircraft guns, more visible to fighter pilots climbing to intercept. He would be the most vulnerable aircraft in the group. The crew knew it. They checked their guns, tested their ammunition feeds, and prepared for the interception they knew was coming. The waist gunners scanned the sky through their open windows. The tail gunner settled into his cramped position, eyes watching the space behind the aircraft where Japanese fighters preferred to attack. New Britain Island appeared on the horizon around 0630. The volcanic cone of Mount Tavorvor rose above the jungle, marking the location of Rabaul's harbor and airfields. Smoke drifted from the mountain's summit, a reminder that the earth beneath the Japanese fortress was as unstable as the war itself. The formation began its bomb run. Bombardiers bent over their Norden sights, calculating speed, altitude, drift. The target was Guadalcanal Airdrome, the largest of Rabaul's 5 airfields. Intelligence photographs showed dozens of Japanese aircraft parked in revetments along the runway. Anti-aircraft fire began at 0645. Black bursts appeared ahead of the formation, the Japanese gunners finding the range. The B-17 seconds held their course, straight and level, refusing to deviate during the critical seconds before bomb release. Pease's lower altitude brought him closer to the guns. Shrapnel pinged against the fuselage, adding new holes to the patches from 2 days earlier. The aircraft shuddered with each near miss, but the engines continued running. The controls continued responding. Bombs away. The bombardier's call came at 0652. The B-17E lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of explosives dropped from the bomb bay. Pease looked down and saw the bombs falling toward the airfield, toward the Japanese aircraft lined up like targets on a range. Explosions erupted across Guadalcanal. Fuel dumps ignited, sending columns of black smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Aircraft caught in the bomb pattern were destroyed instantly. Secondary explosions marked the detonation of ammunition stores. The mission was a success. The target had been hit. Now all they had to do was survive the flight home. The Japanese fighters arrived at 0658. Zeros climbed from multiple airfields around Rabaul, their pilots alerted by the initial anti-aircraft fire. The formation of American bombers was clearly visible against the morning sky, 16 aircraft turning south toward the Solomon Sea and the long flight home. The Japanese pilots immediately identified Pease's aircraft as the most vulnerable target. The B-17E was flying lower than the others, visibly struggling to maintain altitude, separated from the protective fire of the main formation. It was the obvious first target. The first attack came from above and behind. 3 Zeros dove through the formation, their 20mm cannons blazing. Tracers reached toward Pease's bomber. Holes appeared in the wings and fuselage. The B-17's gunners responded immediately. 50 caliber rounds streamed toward the attacking fighters. The tail gunner tracked a Zero through his sights and saw hits spark along its fuselage. The Japanese fighter broke off, trailing smoke. But there were more. Many more. The attacks continued as the formation pulled away from Rabaul. Japanese fighters made pass after pass, concentrating on the stragglers, the damaged aircraft, the bombers that could not keep up with the group. Pease's B-17E took the worst of it. The aircraft was absorbing punishment that would have destroyed most bombers. Holes multiplied across the fuselage. An engine began trailing smoke. The controls grew sluggish as hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines. The crew fought back with everything they had. Spent brass casings piled up around the gunners' positions. The smell of cordite filled the cabin. Voices called out incoming fighters, shouting directions, warning each other of attacks from different angles. At 0720, Engine 3 failed. The propeller windmilled uselessly, creating drag that slowed the aircraft further. Pease feathered the prop, reducing the drag, but the loss of power was catastrophic. The B-17E began falling behind the formation. The other bombers could not slow down. Fuel calculations were already critical. Any aircraft that reduced speed would not make it back to Port Moresby. The formation commander watched Pease's bomber fall back and knew there was nothing he could do. Harl Pease was on his own. The Japanese pilots recognized the opportunity. A single B-17 separated from its formation, damaged and losing altitude. Easy prey. The attacks intensified. Zeros came from every direction, their pilots taking turns making firing passes. The B-17's gunners continued fighting, their barrels growing hot from constant firing. But the defensive fire was weakening. Ammunition was running low, and the damage was accumulating. At 0735, Engine 2 failed. Another propeller windmilled to a stop. The B-17E was now flying on two engines, struggling to maintain 8,000 feet, barely making 150 miles per hour. The radio crackled with Pease's final transmission. Under heavy attack, losing altitude, approximately 100 miles from Rabaul, will try to reach. The transmission cut off. Static replaced his voice. No one in the formation saw exactly what happened next. The other bombers were too far ahead, too focused on their own survival. But intelligence would later piece together the final minutes from survivor accounts and Japanese records. The B-17E continued flying for approximately 15 more minutes. The crew never stopped fighting. Even as the aircraft fell from the sky, even as engines failed and controls stopped responding, the gunners kept firing at the Zeros that swarmed around them. At approximately 0750, the bomber crashed into the jungle, approximately 80 miles south of Rabaul. The impact was not survivable. The aircraft was destroyed. But not all the crew died in the crash. Japanese ground forces reached the crash site within hours. They found wreckage scattered across several hundred yards of jungle, the aluminum skin of the bomber torn apart by impact and fire. Bodies lay among the debris, some still strapped into their positions, others thrown clear by the violence of the crash. 3 men had survived. They were badly injured, barely conscious, but alive. Japanese soldiers took them prisoner and transported them to Rabaul for interrogation. The identity of the 3 survivors remained unknown for years. American intelligence had no way of confirming who had lived and who had died in the crash. Families received the standard telegram: missing in action. What happened to those 3 survivors is one of the darkest chapters of the Pacific War. Japanese military authorities at Rabaul did not treat prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. The interrogation methods were brutal. Medical care was non-existent. Prisoners who survived the initial questioning were often executed once their intelligence value was exhausted. The 3 survivors from Pease's crew endured this fate. The exact date of their deaths is unknown. Japanese records were destroyed or hidden in the final weeks of the war. What is known is that none of them survived to be liberated in 1945. Harl Pease himself did not survive the crash. His body was recovered from the wreckage and initially buried near the crash site. After the war, American graves registration teams located the site and returned his remains to the United States. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Section 12. Grave 7000. 191-2. A simple white headstone marks the spot where America's 1st Army Air Force's Medal of Honor recipient of World War II rests. The Medal of Honor recommendation went forward within days of the mission. Officers who had witnessed Pease's determination to fly the condemned aircraft, who had watched him fall behind the formation and continue fighting against impossible odds, knew that his actions deserved the highest recognition. The citation that accompanied the medal told the story in official language that barely captured the reality. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy on the 7th of August 1942. When one engine of the B-17 bomber, on which Captain Pease was serving as pilot, failed prior to takeoff for a bombing mission on Rabaul, New Britain, he volunteered to fly another unserviceable aircraft, which had been damaged in a previous raid. Upon takeoff, he found that the superchargers were defective and that the aircraft would be unable to reach the altitude at which the formation was to fly. The language continued, describing the attack, the damage, the decision to press forward despite overwhelming odds. But no citation could fully capture what Harl Pease had done that morning. He had chosen to fly an aircraft that everyone else had written off. He had accepted risks that went far beyond normal combat operations. He had continued fighting when every calculation demanded surrender or escape. And he had died ensuring that the mission would succeed, that the Japanese at Rabaul would be distracted at the critical moment when American Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal. The Marines, who landed on August 7th, 1942, faced fierce resistance. But they did not face the full weight of Japanese air power from Rabaul. The bombing raid that Harl Pease had helped execute had destroyed or damaged dozens of enemy aircraft. The Japanese response to the invasion was delayed and disorganized. The connection was direct. Harl Pease's sacrifice had helped give the Marines the time they needed to establish their beachhead. His death had meaning beyond the immediate circumstances of the mission. The medal was presented posthumously to Pease's family in a ceremony at Plymouth, New Hampshire, the town where he had been born 24 years earlier. His father and mother received the nation's highest military honor on behalf of a son they would never see again. The citation was read aloud. The medal was placed in his mother's hands. And Harl Pease Jr. became the first Army Air Forces pilot to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. Others would follow. The war had 3 more years to run. Thousands of American airmen would demonstrate extraordinary courage in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. But Harl Pease was first. His name would always stand at the beginning of the list. The recognition extended beyond the medal. A B-17 was named after him, flying missions in his memory. A Liberty ship was christened SS Harl Pease Jr., carrying supplies across the Pacific to support the war effort he had given his life to advance. Pease Air Force Base in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was named in his honor in 1957. The base served as a strategic air command installation during the Cold War, its bombers carrying the same mission that Harl Pease had understood: deterrence through strength, peace through preparation. The base was closed in 1991 as part of the post-Cold War drawdown. But the name remained, attached to the Air National Guard installation that continues to operate on the site. Every airman who serves there walks past memorials to a pilot who refused to let a damaged aircraft stop him from completing his mission. The 19th Bombardment Group continued operations after Pease's loss. The war demanded it. Replacements arrived slowly, new crews training on the job in the most hostile environment American airmen would ever face. The group flew throughout the Pacific Campaign, striking Japanese targets from New Guinea to the Philippines to Japan itself. By war's end, they had compiled a combat record that included some of the most dangerous missions of the conflict. But no mission equaled August 7th, 1942, for sheer hopelessness. No pilot matched Harl Pease's determination to fly an aircraft that everyone knew should have stayed on the ground. The other 15 bombers that flew to Rabaul that morning all made it back to Port Moresby. Some were damaged. Some had wounded crew members, but all survived. The raid was considered a success, the first step in what would become a prolonged campaign to neutralize Rabaul as a Japanese threat. The Marines at Guadalcanal established their beachhead and began the brutal 6-month campaign that would become one of the defining battles of the Pacific War. The airfield they captured was renamed Henderson Field, and it became the focus of some of the most intense fighting in American military history. The connection between the Rabaul raid and the Guadalcanal success was acknowledged by commanders at every level. The bombers of the 19th Bombardment Group had done their job. The price was Harl Pease and his crew. The fate of the 3 survivors from Pease's crew remained unknown for decades. After the war, investigators interviewed Japanese prisoners and examined captured documents, trying to determine what had happened to American airmen who had been taken prisoner at Rabaul. The evidence was fragmentary. Japanese authorities had destroyed most records relating to prisoner treatment. Witnesses were reluctant to discuss what they had seen. The full truth would never be known. What emerged from the investigation was a pattern of abuse and execution that violated every principle of the laws of war. American prisoners at Rabaul had been beaten, starved, subjected to medical experiments, and ultimately killed. The 3 survivors from Pease's crew had almost certainly shared this fate. War crimes tribunals, after 1945, prosecuted some of those responsible for the atrocities at Rabaul. But justice was incomplete. Many perpetrators were never identified. Many crimes were never fully documented. The dead could not testify, and the guilty often escaped accountability. The families of the 3 crew members who survived the crash received confirmation of their deaths only after the war ended. The exact circumstances remained classified for years. The full horror of what had happened would never be shared with parents and wives who had already suffered enough. Harl Pease's legacy extended far beyond the Medal of Honor and the bases named after him. His story became a teaching example at military academies, a case study in leadership and determination. What made his actions on August 7th so remarkable was not the combat itself. Many pilots fought against impossible odds during World War II. Many died in circumstances as hopeless as Pease's. What set him apart was the choice he made before the mission began. He could have stood down. No one would have questioned the decision. The aircraft was officially grounded. His replacement had mechanical problems. There was no expectation that he would fly. Instead, he spent all night repairing a condemned bomber so that he could join a mission that everyone knew was dangerous. He volunteered for death because the mission mattered more than his own survival. That calculation, that willingness to accept personal destruction in service of a larger purpose, defined the greatest heroes of the war. They were not reckless. They were not suicidal. They understood the odds perfectly. And they chose to fly anyway. Harl Pease understood the odds. He knew his aircraft was compromised. He knew the target was the most heavily defended in the Pacific. He knew that flying at lower altitude would make him the primary target for every Japanese fighter over Rabaul. He climbed into the cockpit anyway. He led his crew into the sky, and he fought until there was nothing left to fight with. The war continued for 3 more years after Harl Pease's death. The tide slowly turned. American industry produced the ships and aircraft that would eventually overwhelm Japanese defenses. American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, each victory bringing them closer to the Japanese homeland. Rabaul, the fortress that had claimed Pease's life, was eventually neutralized through isolation rather than invasion. American commanders recognized that the base was too heavily defended for direct assault. Instead, they bypassed it, cutting its supply lines, bombing its airfields into uselessness, and leaving the garrison to wither. By 1945, the hundreds of fighters that had defended Rabaul in 1942 were gone. The airfields were cratered and abandoned. The mighty Japanese base that had seemed invincible had become an irrelevant backwater. The strategy that neutralized Rabaul had its origins in the hard lessons learned by pilots like Harl Pease. Direct assault against heavily defended positions was costly beyond acceptable limits. Innovation and adaptation were required. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 represented the ultimate expression of that adaptation. Rather than invade Japan at a cost of millions of lives, American planners chose a weapon so devastating that invasion became unnecessary. Harl Pease did not live to see the war's end. But his sacrifice was part of the chain of events that led to victory. Every mission flown against Japanese targets, every enemy aircraft destroyed, every day of delay imposed on Japanese operations contributed to the eventual outcome. The Marines who landed at Guadalcanal because Rabaul's air power had been temporarily blunted went on to fight at Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each battle built on the victories before it. Each sacrifice created opportunities for those who followed. Harl Pease was one link in that chain. A strong link, forged in the fire of the most hopeless mission of the Pacific War. The families of the crew who flew with Pease that morning carried their losses differently. Some found comfort in the recognition their loved ones received. Others struggled with the randomness of war, the arbitrary nature of who lived and who died. Pease's parents lived the rest of their lives in the shadow of their son's sacrifice. The Medal of Honor brought attention they had never sought. Reporters wanted interviews. Officials wanted ceremonies. The quiet life they had built in New Hampshire was forever changed. They accepted the recognition because it honored their son's memory. But they would have traded every medal and every ceremony for one more conversation, one more letter, one more moment with the boy they had raised. The grief never fully healed. Parents who lose children carry that loss forever. The passage of time dulls the pain, but never eliminates it. Harl Pease Sr. and Florence Pease spent their remaining years with an empty place at the table, a missing voice in family gatherings, a son who would never grow old. The crash site, in the jungle south of Rabaul, was eventually located and documented. American graves registration teams reached the area after the Japanese surrender, searching for the remains of airmen who had been lost over the Southwest Pacific. The jungle had already begun reclaiming the wreckage. Tropical vegetation grew through the aluminum skin of the bomber. Vines covered the engines that had carried the aircraft on its final mission. The fuselage had partially collapsed, crushed by the impact and the weight of years. The team recovered what remains they could find. The identification process was difficult. Fire and time had destroyed most evidence. But dog tags, personal effects, and the serial numbers on equipment allowed positive identification of several crew members. Harl Pease's remains were identified and prepared for transport home. The journey that had begun in Plymouth, New Hampshire, that had taken him across America to training bases, across the Pacific to combat zones, and finally to a jungle grave south of Rabaul, would end at Arlington. The burial at Arlington National Cemetery was conducted with full military honors. The flag was folded and presented to his parents. Taps echoed across the rows of white headstones. And Captain Harl Pease Jr., Medal of Honor, was laid to rest among the heroes of the nation he had served. Today, Harl Pease is remembered in ways both grand and intimate. The official memorials, the base named after him, the ships and aircraft that carried his name, all stand as public recognition of his sacrifice. But the more intimate remembrances may matter more. The veterans who told stories about the pilot who refused to stand down. The families who passed down the memory of a relative who had served with Pease. The historians who pieced together the details of August 7th, 1942, ensuring that the facts would not be lost to time. Every Memorial Day, flowers appear at his grave in Arlington. Some are placed by family members, others by strangers who learned his story and felt compelled to pay respects. The headstone does not mention the Medal of Honor, or the condemned aircraft, or the hopeless mission. It simply records his name, his rank, his dates of birth and death. The simplicity is appropriate. Harl Pease was not a man who sought recognition. He was a pilot who saw a mission that needed to be flown and an aircraft that could be made to fly. He put those two facts together and accepted the consequences. That decision, made in the darkness before dawn on August 7th, 1942, defined the rest of his life. The 6 hours that followed, the flight to Rabaul, the bombing run, the fighter attacks, the crash, all of it flowed from that single choice. He could have stayed on the ground. He chose to fly, and that choice made him immortal. The lessons of Harl Pease's story extend beyond the specific circumstances of his mission. They speak to something fundamental about human nature and the demands of service. Every generation faces moments when individuals must decide whether to accept risk in service of something larger than themselves. The risks change, the circumstances change, but the essential choice remains the same. Harl Pease made his choice in the cockpit of a condemned bomber. Others have made similar choices in different settings, different wars, different circumstances. What unites them is the willingness to subordinate personal survival to mission success. This willingness is not recklessness. It is not a death wish. It is a clear-eyed assessment of what matters most, followed by action consistent with that assessment. Pease knew he was likely to die. The damaged aircraft, the distant target, the Japanese defenses, all pointed toward a fatal outcome. But he also knew that the mission was critical, that the Marines at Guadalcanal needed the bombers to hit Rabaul, that every aircraft counted. He weighed his life against the mission and decided the mission weighed more. That calculation is the essence of heroism. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of purpose strong enough to overcome fear. Not the ignorance of danger, but the acceptance of danger in service of something greater. Harl Pease understood danger perfectly. He accepted it completely. And he flew into it with his eyes open and his hands steady on the controls. The final flight of the condemned B-17E lasted approximately 3 hours from takeoff to crash. In those 3 hours, Harl Pease and his crew demonstrated everything that defines military heroism. They prepared thoroughly, working through the night to make an unflyable aircraft flyable. They executed professionally, maintaining formation discipline despite their mechanical handicaps. They fought fiercely, engaging enemy fighters until their ammunition was exhausted. And they never quit, never surrendered, never abandoned their duty, even when death was certain. The Japanese pilots who shot them down respected their courage. Accounts from surviving Japanese aviators mentioned the American bomber that refused to go down, that continued fighting long after it should have fallen from the sky. They did not know Pease's name, but they recognized his determination. Courage is universal. It transcends nationality and ideology. The Japanese pilots who attacked Pease's bomber were themselves brave men, risking their lives for their country just as he was risking his. The difference between them was the cause they served, not the quality of their service. This recognition does not diminish Pease's heroism. It places it in context. He was not fighting monsters. He was fighting human beings who had their own courage, their own determination, their own willingness to die for their beliefs. What makes the American cause worth celebrating is not the courage of American fighters, which was matched by their opponents. It is the purpose that courage served. The defense of freedom, the opposition to tyranny, the belief that human beings deserve to live under governments that serve their interests rather than exploit them. Harl Pease died defending those principles. His sacrifice was part of a larger struggle that would eventually determine the fate of millions. The world that emerged from World War II was shaped by the choices made by people like him, individuals who decided that some things were worth dying for. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please take a moment to hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single week. Stories about pilots who flew condemned aircraft into enemy fire. Stories about crews who volunteered for missions everyone knew were doomed. Real people. Real heroism. Real sacrifice. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, the Philippines, anywhere that people remember the men who flew and fought in the Pacific. Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in World War II. Tell us if you have ever heard of Harl Pease before today. August 7th, 1942. A condemned B-17E. A mission to Rabaul. One pilot who refused to stand down. The ghost of Rabaul earned his Medal of Honor that morning. Harl Pease Jr. earned his place in history. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure the 1st Army Air Force's Medal of Honor recipient of World War II is never forgotten.